Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Construx webinar series. I am Mark Griffin, the host of the Construx Inspect and Adapt podcast, and your host for this morning's webinar entitled Lessons for Supporting and Growing Women Leaders, featuring Construx partner Jessica Garcia. Simply put, women face unique challenges in the workplace, particularly when they're only one of a few on a technical team. So today, Jessica shares some history of women in tech, some highlights, common barriers, and gives tips for being an ally to the women on your teams. Jess is the founder and primary consultant with Vela Coaching based here in the Seattle area. She was introduced through a former colleague to Construx founder Steve McConnell late last year regarding the subject of leadership, and more specifically leadership for women in software. Steve and Jess agreed to offer Jess's expertise to strengthen our training and coaching portfolio using Construx to promote Jess's work. She's been offering her Leadership for Women in Software learning program in our training portfolio for the past 6 months. As part of that work, she's been repeatedly asked how anyone who works with or manages women can support and grow the women in their organizations. And so to address that question, she's put together this webinar to seed key ideas on the topic. Some that you can start today, others you might require systematic changes over time. As a little background, Jess is a self-professed math and science geek, earning a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Washington. Jess worked for Microsoft for 10 years and then got the startup bug, like so many of us have fallen prey to. And she worked for 7 years to build a learning and development consulting firm in Seattle, offering leadership development and sales training to high-tech companies. She combined her technical and professional development expertise during a stint at Tableau Salesforce, where she worked to build leadership capabilities for engineering leaders. Recognizing that this is where her heart lies, she decided to strike out on her own and start Vela Coaching. La Vela is Spanish for the sail, and in Jess's case, it's about how to guide people to sail on their own in a new direction and a better direction. So a couple of housekeeping items before we start. Yes, this is being recorded in case you have to step out or in case you want to share this with colleagues. We plan to have it up on our YouTube channel soon after the recording. If you don't already, you might wish to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can get a steady stream of information about the software development insights you can use to improve your development practices as we add more webinar content over time. Also, you can ask questions anytime during the presentation using the Q&A function in the Teams window toolbar that's up in the top toolbar area. Jess tells me she has some time at the end for the full Q&A, so if you have technical difficulties, you have any issues, you can send us along in the chat and we'll try and help that out. So welcome, Jess, and why don't you grab the tiller and sail us around the sound?
Oh, nice. Nicely put. Thanks for the intro, Mark. I appreciate it. So yeah, Mark did a fantastic intro, and one of the things I wanted to add about why I am focused so heavily on women and growing, especially women in engineering and leadership into leadership positions, is that from my own experience spending 3/4 of my career in technical roles and working on technical teams, it was hard for me to see people like myself leading these organizations. And I felt strongly that there was no reason why we shouldn't be. And during the pandemic and COVID, trying to balance both corporate America and my household made me take the leap that I had been wanting to take at some point to really focus on my business on coaching and consulting, doing leadership development consulting work for women in tech. So I'm excited to have the opportunity to present to everybody today. Really, when we think about how we grow and support women leaders, it's hard to have that conversation without making sure that we're all level set on why it's worth making this change and what is the history of women in computing. It was really fun to dig into this more and just see what our rich history is and how we got to where we are today. And then I want to spend some time really giving you 5 areas that you can focus on. And within each one of those areas will be some ideas, very specific ideas that you might be able to implement or take to your organizations. There's going to be a lot of information here today. I don't expect that everything presented is something you're going to go off and do. I also don't expect that everything presented is going to be something that resonates for you, and that's fine. My hope is that you'll walk away with at least 1 or 2 things that you can either start becoming more aware of or even start working on or taking action on when you go back to your organizations, and then maybe start developing some ideas or a backlog of other stuff that you might want to consider doing in the future. So by all means, while I present a lot of information, really the idea is for you to take 1 or 2 things away from our talk today. So The case for change. Why do we need to have diversity, especially when we look at executive leadership teams and boards? Well, there's actual data that's come out that says companies that do this have higher revenue, full stop. They're also more innovative. That's coming out too. You know, when you have people with different backgrounds, they bring different ideas and opinions to the table that folks might not have thought about before. So overall, this is an impact to the global economy of around $28 trillion by 2025. Those are the estimates. So there is a reason, a business reason why it's important that we see more diversity on our leadership teams, whether that's women or underrepresented minorities on those teams. And then, you know, in general, for women specifically, having them on leadership teams has brought some very clear, does better from organizational development perspective and organizational performance perspective when it comes to having clear, a company having a clearer vision, having employees that are more motivated and engaged, driving accountability in an organization, having stronger leadership and a healthier work environment overall. So there are also benefits from an organizational performance perspective that make the case. Something that I find really funny when I think about this innovation topic is the crash test dummy, right? Why is it that it wasn't until literally like the last couple of months, even in the last, I think, few weeks, that we didn't have a crash test dummy that represented the average size of women across the globe? We used to use the male version, the male crash test dummies that actually represented like something like 5% of women around the world to actually do the testing data, which is just bizarre to me. But it's just one small example of the reason why it's important to bring women into your teams is to just, we think differently. We have a different perspective on stuff. So I just thought I'd share my thinking around the crash test dummy today. And then as we evolve over time, the other thing to think about is, why do we need a case for change? There's some articles about this in Harvard Business Review recently. This should just be, having diverse leadership teams should just be part of our core values. And some companies, like I believe it was Stripe, had empathy as a core value, and underneath that just fell this whole domain of diversity, equity, inclusion. And they, because of that value, just went out and very intentionally made sure they were recruiting from underrepresented groups, whether it be women or minorities, and were able to build their company around that, just this one value. So it is something, while it's good to have the data, it's also just the right thing to do. So how did we get here? I mean, when you look back at the history of computer programming, we've got some very famous women involved. From the very beginning, we had Ada Lovelace back in 1833, partnering up with Charles Babbage to develop what's regarded as the first computer program, which was an algorithm to calculate the Bernoulli sequence for his analytical engine. And then Grace Hopper in the 1950s developing the first computer compiler and one of the first programming languages of COBOL. So we've been involved for a while. And it didn't stop there. In World War II, the code breaking machines had women doing the computer programming in England. In the 1940s, the ENIAC was also programmed. A lot of women were hired to do the programming for that. In 1953, 50% of Raytheon's workforce on the computer programming side were women. And then in 1960, the statistic was that 1 in 4 programmers were women. So this was actually, we were a pretty popular thing, and we were very much in the industry from the very beginning. So much so that back in I think it was the 60s, this article came out in Cosmopolitan magazine called The Computer Girls that was actually touting the benefits of being a computer programmer for the industry and how women could make really good money in this field. And then at the time, women were considered really good for this type of work if they had the analytical capabilities, because it was seen to be a lot more menial in terms of detail-oriented and very methodical. And they thought, well, if you are good at cooking, which at the time women were expected to do, and if you're good at sewing and knitting, then computer programming could be a really good career for you. So it was actually, considered that women were very much suited for these roles. And in the early 80s, so in 83, 84, 37.1% of computer science grads were women. Now, whether this is across bachelor, undergrad, and graduate degrees, I'm not sure, but that's the overall stat that I read. And then when you look 30 years later in 2010, that number dropped dramatically down to 17.6% of this is specifically for women graduating with bachelor's degrees in computer science. It was around 23 and 25% for master's and PhDs. But the number was starting to diminish, at least in the bachelor degree space. And there's several reasons behind that, but one of the core reasons for the decline was seen with the rise of the home computer back in the 80s. When that became available, most of the time those computers wound up in boys' rooms. You know, if a family had a son and a daughter, they would put the computer in the boys' room, and the father might spend time with their boy playing with the computer and maybe, you know, doing some basic programming. So by the time they started entering universities for undergrad degrees in computer science, boys had typically more exposure than girls in doing basic computer programming. And in some cases that turned the girls off. In other cases, it made people feel like, well, girls aren't suited anymore because they're not getting the right exposure at the right time. So there were a mix of reasons, but that was one of the big reasons that you started seeing a decline in young women just trying to pursue these careers. There's also a lot of other reasons, but that's the one that stands out to me as having one of the biggest impacts. And it's funny because research from Carnegie Mellon at the time showed that if the women had stuck it out and stayed in those degrees and graduated, they would have been caught up with the men, and that over time it wouldn't have mattered whether they had come into university with that background. It didn't give people an advantage over the 4 years of their degree. So where are we today? I put a lot of stats on this slide, but the ones that I want to point out are really around technical roles. So there's a lot of information that recently came out in the Women in the Workplace study that was just released a couple months ago by McKinsey. What are women looking for in the workplace? And they have some interesting information there too, specifically around women in technical roles. So some that I want to point out that is just helpful for you to know is that women in technical roles are 2 times more likely to be the only women in the room frequently. And as you can imagine, that's really lonely. I mean, you know, for myself, I spent a huge part of my career in that same situation. And while I was comfortable in those environments, it was what I was used to, and I could do well and thrive in those environments, I still yearned for the opportunity to talk to other women who had walked in my shoes, had similar shared experiences. And then for myself, I found over time that I kind of lost a bit of who I was trying to conform to a male-dominated culture, and you know, really wanted to rediscover myself and really wanted my just general style to be appreciated in the workplace. And in some of the companies that I worked for, you know, this more aggressive, interrupting style was appreciated and valued, which was not who I was, but I started to just kind of conform to that because it was what was necessary. And at the time, it would have been really nice to see people and leaders with different styles and also have more peers that I could talk to about what I was experiencing in the workplace. Another interesting stat is that women-led startups received 2.4% of VC funding in 2021, even less if a woman is Black or Latinx. So there's still a significant lack of funding for women-started companies out there. And then in 2013, there was a study that came out that 50% of technical women switched roles. They didn't leave the workforce. They just switched their careers or switched to other fields after 12 years. So we've made progress in terms of trying to talk about diversity and how important it is, and especially, you know, how we can support women in technical roles, but we really haven't seen many gains at all. So these are just, it's good to kind of be aware of the history and the picture of where we are today so we can think about what we can do to retain the women that we do have. So let's talk about what we can do. So we have this idea, some context setting. There's really looking at all the information on the books and articles that I've read, and then my own experience coaching women in the workplace, I'd say there's really 5 main areas to think about when you're looking to retain women in the workforce. I want to say retain very specifically because I'm not going to spend time talking about the gap in the pipeline, how to recruit. That could be its own talk on its own. But assuming you have women within your organizations, these are the 5 major areas to consider when you want to think about being an ally and retaining these women. 1 is around well-being. 2 is flexibility. 3 is DEI, a company and organization and team that emphasizes and considers DEI as important. The other 4th is visibility, and the 5th is feedback. So I'll go into each one of those. Now, I'm not saying that these things are not important to men by any stretch. What I'm saying is that these are levers and drivers that keep women in a company, that are more likely to be one of the reasons a woman makes the decision to stay or leave or to accept a job offer. So when you focus in these areas, these are the kind of things that matter as a whole, not to every woman, but as a whole, to women in the workplace. So having a manager who cares about their well-being really matters. It's not just about the work that's getting done, but it's really understanding the whole person. And that's come out for everyone, not just women, over the last couple of years, more so since COVID. But this is a bigger driver for women than it is for men in why they stay or make the decision to join a company. And yet, less than 50% of people say that their manager shows an interest in their career and helps them manage their workload, which is all part of that well-being when you're at work. How do you feel emotionally and psychologically supported? Do you feel like there's an element of trust in your organization? Thinking about managing that whole person and their well-being is really important. And what's interesting in this space is that women managers tend to do this more often than men, their male counterparts. This is just something that women will do. So when you have women in the workplace who are managing people, regardless of gender, they just naturally tend to focus on well-being, which is unfortunately not seen and managed from a performance perspective, or appreciated as much as it could be, because there's also research on that performance reviews don't always emphasize or highlight that a manager that manages their employees' well-being is valued. So how do we do this? What are some things to think about when we're managing the well-being of our staff? One thing is to just check in, right? Like, we can be very task-oriented, and obviously that's part of a job if we're managing, whether you're managing managers or managing individual contributors, or even just a scrum master on the team, and you're trying to just make sure the dynamics of this team stay healthy. Being able to balance not just the work that's getting done, but also how people are feeling doing that work is really important. So taking time to get to know them and understand what's going on for them, because that can impact performance. Conducting regular one-on-ones is really key to this, and I provide some like a little set of questions that you can consider when you're doing your one-on-ones that include not just checking in on the work, but how people are feeling and how they're doing around that work, which can also, over time, just kind of build that trust with your team that you genuinely care about their well-being. And some of you might already be doing this regularly, which is great. Some of you might look at this list of questions and go, oh, there's one I haven't asked. That's an interesting one to add. And then others might spend more time focusing on task and not have time in your one-on-ones to add these types of questions. So maybe it just makes sense to check in every couple of one-on-ones as you start building this muscle. Another thing that relates closely to well-being is how people are feeling managing their workloads, right? So how do you make sure that you're clearly prioritizing work for people? As requests are coming into the team, how well are you doing seeing whether those requests can be managed by your team, or if your team's at capacity, pushing back on some of those requests, feeling comfortable renegotiating, and making sure that the workload stays manageable and sustainable. Sometimes people just naturally jump to, yes, I want to help, because that's important to you, getting things done and getting the work done, without taking a moment to figure out whether or not your team or even yourself can manage that work. Managing up relates really closely to this. How comfortable are you having those hard conversations with the people above you who are asking for work to get done, especially if it's going to be a conversation where it's not necessarily possible to get the work done, or you're not setting your team or yourself up for success. Getting comfortable having those exchanges and negotiations back and forth really helps set your team up for a more manageable workload, and yourself. And then finally, recognize, if you're managing managers, recognize the managers who support well-being and the well-being of their team. Have that be something that their goal performance is rated against and that they're goaled on. I know, some organizations include OHI, or Organizational Health Index, results in their managers' performance reviews. So that's something to keep in mind, because those OHI's scores can tie really closely to managing the well-being of your team. Okay, second area is flexibility. So another driver that keeps women in their jobs or makes them accept an offer is how flexible the work arrangements are. And specifically around remote and hybrid work are those options. Only 1 in 10 women wants to work mostly on site. So that's a pretty small number. And if you're in an organization that's required everybody to come back to the office, or required them to come back several days a week, it's important to check in on how people are feeling about that. Again, it's not to say that all men want to go to the office and all women want remote and hybrid options. It's just to say that this is a lever that's more important to women than it tends to be for men. It's one of their top 3 drivers, especially for women leaders. And one of the reasons for that is that women do, especially and particularly women with families, do 2.1 times more of the unpaid work at home. So that includes everything from managing the kids' schedules and camps to maybe doing laundry and cooking. Some of those traditional roles, unfortunately, still fall oftentimes on women at home. So they want the flexibility, especially in the last couple of years during COVID. They've noticed that having that flexibility of being back home gives them an easier path to managing all of those things. So it's helpful to understand that that's work that's not typically recognized, but it can add up to quite a few hours, in fact, over 30 in a week. Sheryl Sandberg made headlines back in, I think it was 2012 or 2013 that this article was published, where she said she would go home at 5:30 every day to have dinner with her family, and it made waves. For her especially, she said she would leave coats in her office to make it look like she was there, somewhere on campus, and hadn't left work, because she felt so uncomfortable telling people that she would leave for that period of time every day to have dinner. Now, of course, she'd go home for herself. It made sense to go home and log back on in the evenings, but she built this work schedule that gave her the flexibility to make sure she was there for those family dinners every night. And it was seen as such a shockwave to the industry that she was willing to admit that, which I find funny. But it's important to know that, offering remote and hybrid work options is really one of those things that's going to make women want to stay or join. So if you're at a company that's requiring everyone to come back to the office, are there exceptions that can be made? What are the reasons for those exceptions? And would you be willing to work with someone around that? The big thing that supports this work is making sure that people's objectives and performance expectations are crystal clear. If there are crystal clear expectations around what good performance looks like and when things need to get done, and people hold themselves accountable, then flexible work arrangements can work. It's not just for people in the examples I've given that have families. There's some folks who are night owls who work much better in the evenings, and they just want a set of core work hours during the day where they can log into calls and check in and collaborate with their colleagues. And other people are morning people. So flexibility can be defined in a lot of different ways, but it's this idea that we're not all having to be in the same place for these specific hours every day that folks are looking for some negotiation and movement on. And I always encourage managers to ask their employees what flexibility means to them. So I'm making some gross, generalizations around that, but it's really good to know for each individual, what does flexibility look like? And it might be as simple as, hey, I just want to be able to block my lunch hour every day. okay, to them, that might be how they define flexibility. And to someone else, it could be like, hey, I do early morning calls with Europe often, and I just want to make sure that Mondays and Fridays are not Europe calls. So there's a spectrum. It's just good to know where people sit. Let people choose. So going back to knowing what it is, how they define flexibility, let them choose, within what's allowed in policies of your company, let them choose. Don't dictate what they do for work. And then support time blocks, which I talked about, and consider that there's now this concept of work-life integration versus work-life balance. Work-life balance is, typically when people clock in or they're working for certain core hours in a day, and then when they leave at home, they're at home leave for home, they're at home at night. That's kind of what work-life balance looks like. Now more than ever, people are thinking about work-life integration, which is important to some people, not everybody. This idea that during the day I could go do my laundry, or I can go run errands, or I can go pick up the kids, is kind of blending the concepts of work and life. And for some people that works for them, and they want the flexibility to do that. So just be aware of this new term called work-life integration that might work really well for some people that work for you. All right, development opportunities is this third area. And women leaders are just as ambitious as men in terms of what they want to do and moving into senior leadership roles. Yet what's interesting is starting at the very beginning, in general, women just trying to get to that first ladder of management are at a deficit. Only 87 women are promoted into first line manager roles for every 100 men that are. So they start out as a deficit, and then it kind of continues to decline from there. It's also more often than not that women will be promoted into staff and principal level roles and be elevated based on their technical expertise, as opposed to given responsibility for the business and an actual P&L. So 20% of women in upper middle management actually manage a P&L. So there's a lot of work that can be done to help women grow and develop in the areas of business management. So very specific things you can do around development opportunities. Mentoring has been something people have talked about for a really long time. How do you give women mentors who can help them with political navigation, who can help them increase their technical skills, or any skill that they need to develop? And ideally finding mentors that are other women can be really helpful. If you've got, Black and Latinx people in your workforce, same thing. See if you can find someone who comes from a similar background that they can relate to. Sponsorship is an area to help develop women that's actually been diminishing a bit over the years, because sponsors argue that they really, as they should, really want to know the people that they're sponsoring. So tying in high visibility projects and giving your employees the ability to work on strategic projects and things that are highly visible, and having new sponsors for that gives them exposure to people they might not have been exposed to. So then those folks are more willing and more comfortable to sponsor them. So sponsorship and high visibility projects go hand in hand. Networking is critical as well for women. And I mean in terms of who their peers are, making sure that there are connection points for other women in the workplace. One of the key reasons people go through my leadership program, or one of the benefits they find when they go through it, is that they start developing a network of people outside their organizations who they can talk to, they can relate to, sometimes commiserate with. And that's nice. It's nice to be able to have people with shared experiences to bounce ideas off of and get support from. And then finally, offer training and coaches to your women. There are areas that, again, in general, not every woman has challenges in these areas, but overall, in general, there's some key areas that they could use more support on. Setting vision is one. Political navigation is another, and then negotiating is the third. So, when you think about putting women through leadership programs or training programs, those are a few areas that could be very specifically helpful to women. Right. Fourth area to focus on is DE&I, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And women actually see this as a driver that's important to them. Organizations that put an emphasis on there, whether it's in core values, whether it's in the recruitment process, the whole spectrum of things relating to DEI, and the emphasis there is important to women. And women are more likely to spend time on DEI activities. So whether it's, participating on interview loops, or whether it's participating in DEI, could be affinity groups within an organization, that women will spend more time here, but it's not often recognized, even though it's a driver for employee engagement. It's not often recognized in their performance reviews. Something else that kind of around this that's important when I think about inclusion is that there's studies that show that women tend to get interrupted a lot in the workplace. In fact, men will dominate 75% of the conversation. I think this research came out of some congressional hearings, if I remember correctly. And it's what I have personally experienced in the workplace too. There's just different dynamics with how men and women might communicate in groups. Again, not every woman is like this and not every man is, but as a whole, there's dynamics there to consider. And, what does that do over time in the workplace when you're not hearing those voices that aren't getting heard? Same thing with introverts. There's some people who are not going to be the loudest person in the room sharing their opinion freely. So how do we make sure that we're making space for those folks? And finally, a lot of leadership traits get defined, like what makes a good leader, and power dynamics in an organization can get defined by one very specific group of people. So there's actually a Stanford professor who has a whole book around power and power dynamics, who's very clear that you have to be aggressive, you have to be almost cutthroat. I'm not using his exact words, but this is how I summarized. And you have to be a certain persona, like make yourself a certain persona to get ahead in organizations. And so when you perpetuate that stereotype, it can really exclude people from groups that don't do that naturally. Whether it's women or whether it's people who come from cultures that are much more collaborative, where it's more about the group than it is about the one individual person, telling them to be that way goes very counter to who they might be at the core. So we need to think about how we redefine those power dynamics and leadership traits in organizations. So there's a lot here, and I focus more on inclusion when I'm talking about areas that we can change. Some of these are huge systemic changes. I'm not saying that anyone's going to go off and do regular compensation reviews if your company's not already doing it, but these are things that companies that are kind of leading in this space do on a regular basis. So regular compensation reviews, making sure, taking a look at comp, not only for gender, but also across races, and seeing how everyone is paid for the same work. And sometimes it can go both directions. I think at Google, when they did their compensation review a few years ago, they found that their women were getting paid more than their men. So they made amends to that. So just doing that on a regular basis and building that muscle can help diminish the differences over time. And then evaluating the performance review and promotion process. For example, I've talked about performance reviews, including work that people do on well-being or work that people do on DEI. That can be really helpful to expanding thinking beyond the work that's just getting done and the tasks and deliverables that are getting met. And then systemically, this is a huge one. Do you think about redefining leadership traits and leadership styles that are considered the right ones for your organization? Can you make space for people with different leadership styles who are going to also offer a different point of view and different opinion and something that you haven't thought of before? And at the team level, things you could implement actually today or tomorrow, thinking about redesigning meetings, offer pre-reads for folks who are not as willing to speak up during a meeting. Maybe they're more introverted. Just give them that space to digest what they're about to walk into if a decision needs to be made or input needs to happen in the meeting. Or give people the chance to follow up after the meeting, share the information during the meeting, and then give them a way, whether it's 24 hours or a different mechanism, to come back with any feedback they have. I know for myself, if it's an area that I'm not as familiar with, I need time to digest what I heard and come up with an articulate response that I want to share back. On teams, how do you leverage everyone's unique strengths instead of everyone forcing everybody to have a specific be a specific way, for example? How do you make sure that you have complementary strengths and work and leverage those complementary strengths across your team? And then give gender inclusive feedback. So words like, this is interesting, I just learned this, words like rock star, for example, are considered more masculine. So when you're using them as a way to assess performance, or even in a job description, it can be seen as not being gender inclusive and turning some people off from their jobs, or having people not understand what is a rock star and how do you define that. So let's go into the final area, which goes much deeper into feedback. And that's around giving specific feedback. So there's research that shows that women tend to get less actionable feedback than men, and much more vague feedback. So here's some common phrases that you might have heard or experienced yourself. Women will hear things like, you need to be more aggressive, you need to speak up more, and you need to have more executive presence. And when you look at that, what does that actually mean? Why is that important? How do you define that? So getting specific, instead of like having a headline like that, just get really specific. Why would it be important to be aggressive? What does that look like? And when you start peeling back the onion to figure out the reason why you're sharing that feedback, you might surprise yourself. And I'll give an example of that in a minute. The other thing to be aware of is that women experience the double bind. So on the one hand, we're told, oh, you need to be more aggressive. But then on the other hand, we're told, oh, you're too bossy. Or you need to speak up more. Oh, now you're being too direct. And this happens a lot. I think most women that I have worked with and coached have experienced a number of these. So just keep in mind that a lot of times we're hearing mixed messages because people aren't necessarily sure what they're comfortable with in terms of how we behave or how we show up at work. So when you give feedback, and you give specific feedback, I'm saying use a model. There's a bunch of books out there that give you a framework to deliver feedback in a meaningful and thoughtful way. And the thing that I really like about these models, and I'm not saying that I have a preference about any of these books, but just giving you examples of some that are out there, is that it forces you to stop and think about what your feedback is actually about and make it actionable and specific. I even use the example from my kids' school. If any of you have children, they might have learned the feedback model, bugs and wishes. It bugs me when you do this. I wish you would do blah, blah, blah. And it's just a nice way to remind yourself that you're giving people feedback on a behavior and how it impacts them or how it impacts you, and then giving them the opportunity to talk through what it is in a much more meaningful way. Pick your poison. Again, there's a bunch of different models out there. Gender test the feedback. Is this feedback that you are giving to this person the same feedback that you would give to a man in the same situation? It's sometimes interesting to consider you might not. You might just be thinking about giving that feedback to a woman, but wouldn't give it to a man. Make feedback frequent. Don't make it something you only do because HR is forcing you to have a performance conversation. Just build it into your DNA and do it immediately. So if you're in a meeting with somebody, whether you want to give them great acknowledging feedback that something went well, or oops, something that needs to be worked on, or that you noticed, do it as soon as possible. Don't wait for the next one-on-one to bring it up, because by then the time's already passed. And then remember the positive. As folks with engineering jobs, a lot of times we're spending every day looking at problems and trying to fix them, which doesn't translate to people. Like, it's really good to recognize the good that you see. And sometimes for some of us, that muscle can be really hard. So I'm presenting a model here that I use in my class, and I want to give you the chance if you want to take a photo of this, but it's a model that I love that's designed for not just professional work settings, but also personal work settings. You can use it at home if you want to practice there. And it's just 5 simple steps. I like to start with the wants in a part of the pie, where you frame the conversation. What is it you want to talk about? And let someone know, hey, I want to discuss something that I noticed the other day, and talk it through with you. Then share the observable facts. What is it that you saw, and what patterns of behavior are you seeing that are making you bring this up? Something that a journalist would see, someone who's very, or a private detective. They're taking a look and just noticing the facts. Then share what your thoughts are around it. What meaning are you making? Don't presume that you know how someone feels. Don't presume that you know the intention behind what they did. You're just telling them what impact it had on you and what you noticed about it. If you're comfortable, share how it's making you feel. I'm feeling nervous that I noticed X or Y, or I'm concerned that this might impact your ability to rise in this organization. And then finally, when you close the feedback conversation you're having, just talk about next steps. Hey, I like, and so I want to talk with you about, how we might just develop the skill further. Or I want to talk with you about when we can discuss this again, because I can see that you're, I'm noticing that you might be upset about it. So using a framework like this just gets you to think through very intentionally what you want to say. And the example they'll pull out is around executive presence. When you think about, in this example, I thought, okay, if someone said executive presence to me, how could I structure a conversation around that? Well, maybe I want to talk to you about working more effectively with senior leaders. And I'm bringing this up because I believe it's an area to develop in order to be more effective in your role. In the last 3 business reviews we've had, I noticed with the leadership team, I noticed that you go deep into the technical details when you're asked a question, and it's caused the meetings to spiral and move off topic. So the perception that I'm getting and that people are noticing is that you're not ready to climb the ladder because you don't know how to have conversations at the business level. You're so focused on the technical weeds. And it's making me feel nervous because I want you to be able to grow your career, and I know this is important to you. And if we can work on this, then it's a skill that's good that will serve you as you continue to climb. Finally, I'd like to hear about what your observations are around this, whether you want to take time to think about it or talk about it now, because I really want to think about development opportunities to help you grow in this area. So that's one way to take executive presence as feedback and blow it up into a much more meaningful conversation. So with the other side of feedback, it's not just about giving feedback, but it's also about receiving feedback. And for women, it's good to know that we have a very unique relationship with feedback. It comes from historical history and then also biology. So from a historical perspective, for a long time, for millennia, in many cultures around the world, women could not own their own assets. We couldn't have money, we couldn't buy property. And the only way for us to, survive, so to speak, was to marry into those things. And one way to do that was to be likable, to have traits that people appreciated about us enough to bring them on and support us. So it was one of the things that historically got us by, was our likability, which gives us a very unique relationship with feedback. And one reason why sometimes we can take things personally, that is hard to separate. The other reason is biological. There's actually research that shows that women are more in tune with nonverbal cues. Part of this is from raising infants and babies who can't communicate with words and being able to pick up on those subtle things that are not being said. So in a meeting where this could take place is if a woman is picking up that one person in the meeting is not, is not paying attention. They're either distracted on their phone or showing body cues that they're not interested in the topic. The woman will kind of subconsciously spend time trying to figure out why that person's not listening, as opposed to paying attention to everything else and everyone else in the room that's indicating that they are. So there is some subtle reasons why we have a different relationship with feedback than men. It doesn't mean that we can't overcome those. It's just good to be aware of. And sometimes we can use those. I mean, it's great to know that women will pick up what's not being said, because you can check in with them after the meeting and say, oh, is there anything I missed? Did you notice anything else going on there? And it might be that the woman can say, yeah, I noticed so-and-so was on their phone and very distracted, and I don't think that they were interested in what you were saying or paying attention. So long story short, it doesn't mean that men don't notice these things. It's just that women will tend to notice them more. And not all women are good at this. So I definitely don't want to say that we are all good at this. I know myself, it's taken time for me to grow that muscle of noticing nonverbal cues. And then if you're a manager, just ask for feedback regularly if you're not doing it already. All right. So I do want you to take one moment to, before we move on and to questions, just think about what you learned today that you didn't know before. I know I presented a lot of information, so take a moment to think about what you learned today you didn't know before, and what's one thing that you want to do differently. And that could either just be start noticing something more. You don't have to actually do anything about it, but just start picking up on something more or take an action, whether, might be do better one-on-ones or more regular one-on-ones. So I'll give you a moment to do that while Mark queues up the questions.
Great job, Jess.
Thanks, Mark.
Give folks a little bit more time here. But while they're waiting, I think I'll mention in the era of shameless self-promotion with regards to the content that's in this particular webinar, a reminder that the next Leadership for Women in Software cohort that Jess is going to teach is now forming. It's a 6-session program, starts on January 18th, runs through to February 22nd, 7:30 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific time. And I think that'd be a great way to fulfill one of the Jess's development opportunities that she mentions today, which is this idea of networking. Get in there and go with some of the colleagues who are like-minded that you can start sharing things with. And you mentioned, I think before, Jess, when you've taught this, that there have been people that have connected outside the class and have become sort of a little group, which I think is really wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do. Yeah, and they'll also, people growing through the program will also pick up on some of those core skills I talked about in terms of vision setting and negotiating and advocating for themselves better and political navigation.
Absolutely. All right, here's a question for you. Do you have any recommendations for DEI activities that we could start if the company doesn't offer any?
That's a big question. Where to begin? One thing that I've actually seen that's been effective has been book clubs, where teams start a book club and select a book, how to be anti-racist, for example, and read that together and talk about it. So, it could be as simple as starting a book club. It could be as even bigger as in terms of asking your company, why not? Why isn't this an area they focus on, and why is it important to you that they do?
That's a good idea. Yeah, I'm not going to give you any softballs here. Here's another one.
Okay.
My company really treats us like second-class assets, even in leadership roles. How do I fight back against that tide without being seen as the lone voice screaming into the wind?
Yeah, that's a contentious one, right? Because off the cuff, the first thing I would say is thinking about, if you're feeling that way, whether you are in the right company. As much as I would like to encourage you to try to be that lone wolf or try to gather up your peers to do that, which is certainly one recommendation, would be to try to get a group of people together and start having conversations with people higher up in your company about why this is important. It also might be to consider that if your company doesn't have that as a priority already, because a lot of times they say the most effective companies are the ones that drive this from the CEO on down, that it might be really difficult to make that change in your company. So you might have to be willing to see how important it is for you and make a decision of whether you stay or go.
Good answer. So this is kind of a link question. Do you have any examples of companies who do this well or have done this well?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the ones that stood out to me that I learned more about recently, one was Quip, that was when originally founded by Brett Taylor. He just had he had, I think, recently become a father, and really felt, or his co-founder had a child, and they felt it was really important to make sure that they maintained work-life balance. So counter to what everyone else was doing in Silicon Valley, they set the company up to not offer dinners and encourage their employees to go home by, I think it was 6:30 every single night. And they even had signs around the office that were basically like, you have a life outside of work, and encouraging people to do that and respecting that. The other company that comes to mind is Slack. Stuart Butterfield was their CEO, still is, although I think he's now leaving Salesforce, is what I heard, because they got acquired by Salesforce a few years ago. At Slack, he felt so strongly about empathy as one of their core values that he put basically the DEI umbrella fell through that, underneath that, and everything he did centered around getting more and hiring more women and underrepresented minorities into his everything, leadership team, all the way on down to individual contributors. And at one point, I think it was 35% of the engineering team were women. And they also had a rule about making sure that they put women on teams with other women, so they weren't the onlys on their team. So I think those are two examples of where a CEO made this a priority, and from there, everything happened.
Good job. Well, I think this question is maybe similar. It sort of touches on a couple of things you just mentioned, but my company talks a good talk about wanting to recruit more diverse talent and have more women in leadership positions. But year after year, I don't see any changes in either of those areas. What do you recommend I can do?
This is similar to the other question from a little earlier. I'd say first, hold your leaders accountable. Call them on it. We keep saying we're doing all this work. Where are the numbers? Why aren't we making progress? What are we trying differently? And then think about how you're going to respond to the answers. Are these answers that are, really going to be? Are you going to tolerate the status quo, or is it so important to you that you're willing to move on and find a company that actually is making traction in these areas? I know it's not necessarily the answer that's easy to hear, but it is important to know that what you value as a person, you should expect in your companies too. Otherwise, over time, you're going to feel misaligned.
Sure. So this is a general question about the leadership program. And you mentioned you talked through a lot of topics today in the webinar. What sort of topics do you cover in the leadership program that's coming up?
Yeah, so we cover a variety of things. I say the overall theme is around self-awareness and how to remove some of the barriers that can get in our way of progressing. So we start with really understanding our strengths, doing the Clifton Strengths Assessment, and how to work those strengths and what happens when we overdo those strengths. Then we move into really understanding team dynamics and what are the key things that influence healthy teams, and how to recognize when those are unhealthy and unbalanced for yourself as an individual and as a manager. And then how to move through something that women experience a lot is this inner critic, how to work through that inner critic, what it means, how to really start trusting your gut and your inner mentor to help you progress, and maybe have conversations that you wouldn't feel comfortable having. Like we teach negotiation skills, how to advocate for yourself, how to define work-life balance, what flexibility means to you and what's important, and be able to express that to people in your organizations. And then vision, setting a personal vision and how that can influence, how you set visions for your team, but also how you make sure that the work you're doing today aligns to where you want to be in the future. So getting more intentional about your career.
And this is a smaller group, right? You're not talking about 50 people online. It's something that's a little more intimate.
Yeah, it's, between typically 12 and, 16 people. Mm-hmm. So you get to know the people really well. And a lot of the program is structured around breakout groups. So every week you'll learn some content, and then you do the work in the breakout rooms to work through the models for yourself, practice conversations that you need to have, and just start getting advice and thoughts from other people.
Excellent. Well, I don't think I see any other questions coming in at this point in time. Any closing thoughts for everybody that you want to share?
Yeah, it's funny because when I answered that DEI question, I answered it very quickly with a very simple and small answer. I want to make sure that I want to go back to that as I've had time to think about it. Where to start with DEI? There's a huge, this is obviously a huge space. I mentioned the book club as a very small and easy way to get started, but I would start reaching out. I'm surprised if organizations don't have people at least thinking about this or focusing on this, and start asking questions. Who is focused on DEI? Who else can we be talking to see what initiatives they might be considering, or reach out to your network, see what other companies are doing, because you can do things at a systemic level, like from recruiting, because that's a big one, thinking about making job descriptions more inclusive, making the network you reach out to apply for those jobs much larger, casting a wider net and going to places that you wouldn't normally, thinking about getting references from outside your network. So there's a whole pipeline from recruiting and hiring and onboarding all the way up to leadership to consider with DEI. So I would say, there's a lot of literature out there. Please don't just start with a book club. And I don't want to diminish the work. It's a massive space, and there's a lot of people doing a ton of good work in that area. It's not an area, DEI overall, that I'm a practitioner in or claim to be, just because of my own experiences. So
Right.
I'm hoping that's at least giving you something to think about.
All right, cool.
Cool.
So one last comment, and I swear nobody paid for this, but someone posted in, just wanted to share that I was in Jessica's Leadership for Women in Software program, and I recommend it to all women, even the ones not in leadership. As an individual contributor, I learned so many skills that I use often at work and in my personal life.
Oh, sweet.
So there you go.
That's great to hear.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
Thank you very much, Jess. This has been a really, really wonderful experience. Thanks for sharing your knowledge. I hope that people take away some things from this and they can start using things right away.
Me too.
And thank you, everyone, for being online. Again, a reminder that this is actually going to be up on our YouTube channel shortly. Feel free to share it with our folks, and hope to see you, some of you, in the class in January. Take care. Have a great day.
Take care, everyone. Bye.